Greetings and welcome back to the Old Ways Rising Farm YouTube channel for our third video on natural whetstones. In the first two, we talked at length about whetstones, how they form, how to go about looking for good, useful, natural materials in the wild. Link at the top of the screen to the very first video in this series, and the end screens will walk you through if you want to start at the beginning and work on. In this video, what we're going to do is we're going to take these two stones that I've already talked about in those previous videos. These are both some different flavors of indurated sandstone. And we're going to work them up into finished stones and test them and evaluate what their usefulness will be. So if you just want to see how to take a stone you've already found and turn it into a useful whetstone with simple tools that you probably already have, keep watching this one. Otherwise, you can go click that link and start at the beginning. But for now, let's dig into it. So when we're working on this, pick the best face. These are split and sawn chunks. So I don't have anything that's real woogity. If you're collecting stones from the wild, yes, you will have some stuff that's real woogity going on. You might need to even take a bit of a hammer and chip away some of that. Now, the types of sedimentary and metamorphic material that's going to make a good whetstone is going to tend to be the same sort of materials that have clear cleavage planes. So if hypothetically I had a big lump here, I can see where the bedding planes are. You would just take a bricklayer's hammer and whack on that, or take a cold chisel, okay, and split that off. These are pretty clean. This one I could work from either face. This one I have a clean face here, and I'm very clearly not going to choose that face. Right? So that just needs to be, I'll need to do a little bit of work on it so that it sits level. Okay? We'll talk about that, but this is going to be the face that I actually clean up. So for most of these, there's some exceptions. I might or might not have one here, but for most stones, you're going to have a pretty soft binder, and some sort of common sandpaper will work well. So I've said it many times before on this channel, and I'll say it many times again. Cheap sandpaper is not worth free. To do this, you need a good, wet, dry sandpaper that's intended for use with metalworking. Okay? So get good emery cloth or good garnet sandpaper. This little strip is 220 grit Rhino Wet, and this is just emery cloth. Okay? And this, I got a whole big stack of this stuff. I have that for a lifetime. This little pack was $5 for 3 pieces, right? So not super crazy expensive. And I'm just going to start with the coarsest good sandpaper that I can get my hands on. I need a flat surface, and I need to do this outside. We're going to make a whale of a mess here. Okay? So when I look at this piece, I have a little bit of light texture on that face and a heavier texture on this face. So I'm going to go with the easier to work face. I'm going to put a little bit of water on it. We're going to see how does this react with water. Is this going to be, this is just splashing on the surface and it's sitting there, so absorbing a lot. When I wipe my fingers across it here, I can see it does absorb eventually, but this is going to be mostly a splash and go stone, which is nice. We're going to wet the sandpaper good. We're going to wet the stone good. Okay. And now we're going to start making a mess. Just simply sanding the stone. And you can see I've already made substantial, that's half smooth. Now, as we're doing this, we're going to learn our first little bit of information about how this is going to work as a stone. This is making a nice slurry. And also note this slurry is largely silica, so you do not want to breathe this. This is another reason to do it well. And yeah, nice slurry on top, starting to get relatively smooth. Let's rinse it off and see what our scratch pattern's looking like here on the stone itself. Now, if you didn't have sandpaper, and I can't imagine why you wouldn't have sandpaper, but I guess there's always the hypothetical lost in the woods sort of question. But you could do this with two stones, one across another. Doing this on a known flat reference surface is the quickest way to get it flat. It's a little more difficult to get it flat with two stones because they'll each have their own irregularities. But it will work. Okay. And this is also going to bring up the question, how flat is flat enough? So as I'm looking at this, surface is largely sanded to my 50 grit. I've got a little chunk here, make a smear there, that's not sanded all the way down, and I don't care. I'm going to use this stone, it's going to make slurry as I use it, and it's going to dish, it's going to warp, it's going to need touched up, not warp with heat, but dish out because of uneven grinding, right? It's not going to stay perfectly flat even if I make it perfectly flat right now. So I don't care about that. I'm not going to grind through that. I am going to switch to a piece of 150 grit, give it a couple swipes on this. You can see we're not taking a whole ton of time with this. This isn't a long process. Do a little bit here. And if you're doing blades with an apple seed edge, whether that's a hatchet or a general field knife for field dressing or something where you want that extra durability of having that apple seed edge, you're not going to even really benefit from having a perfectly flat stone. That little bit of a dish can be an advantage. I think people worry a little bit too much about that perfect flatness. Okay, so that's nice and smooth. The last thing I want to do before I call this surface done is just take some 220 grit. Just very quickly give it a once over. Oh, this is going to be, I'm liking this stone already. It's developing a nice slurry really, really quick. This is going to be a good stone. It's going to be a good stone. Okay. Now, why did I do that? Well, as I work this with steel, it's going to work up this slurry and it's going to resurface very quickly. But in that first use, and we'll try this out together, in that first use, if I don't go and use the 220 on it, and I just use one of the really coarse grits, it can give it an artificially coarse tooth in that first use. And that's common. That's common on a lot of stones that are just cut with a saw and left and sold, right? I've read old sources talking about, historic works, talking about using whetstones, and they'll say, they always cut so fast the first time you use it, and then it goes down to normal, and it persists at that. Why? We don't know why that happens. Well, the answer why that happens is artificial tooth from the saw that was used to cut it. Okay? Or the grit used on the lap wheel if it was cut with something really rugged like this and then lapped flat. Okay? So I'm going to set this aside for the time being because I want to look at this one. Now this is the one in the last video that we talked about being a grade kind of partway between sandstone and quartzite. And it's kind of a toss-up whether it would be officially classified as sandstone or quartzite. Now this is a really hard material. The advantage to having some really hard stones in your collection is when you go to sharpening something like a graving chisel, where you have an awl, where you have a really fine point, it won't dig in as much. Okay. The downside is they load up and they don't build slurry well. So I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to dress this with this sandpaper or if I'll need to go to a diamond file. I don't currently own a diamond file big enough to dress this whole stone. So if it turns out to be in diamond file territory, then we'll just set it aside and enough for now. But I want to get that middle sanded down and see what it does. It is cutting. It's actually cutting fairly well. So that is optimistic, because this is sandstone and not all the way to quartzite. Quartzite would not cut on emery cloth and would end up being trash because it would never develop any kind of slurry and would just load up and not wear at all. A good whetstone has to wear some. Now that being said, it's going to take its merry time. So I'm going to turn the camera off here, work on this for a few minutes. So that piece of sandpaper already ate my piece of coarse sandpaper. So you're going to definitely go through some paper doing this, especially with a really hard stone like this one is. But I just want to show you, this is the 150 again. It does build up slurry, but see how much slower it's building up that slurry than the previous stone. Mm-hmm. Okay? So this does still have some earthy minerals in it. It's not fully metamorphosed to quartzite. But as an highly indurated sandstone, it's much, much harder. Maybe not quite as hard as Arkansas stone, but we're getting into that category. This process with sandpaper will not work on an Arkansas stone. You need diamond tools for that. Or a lap wheel and a diamond or cerium oxide or something like that, a really, really hard grit. But I have a nice flat spot here that is flat enough that we can test the stone. Okay, so we'll get that out of there, just like before. My little flat spot, I'm going to give a little shot with the 220 grit, diamond, or not diamond, but garnet paper. Okay, just make sure that there's no artificially large grit on there. See, there is slurry, but very, very light, very, very little. Mm-hmm. That's that hardness. Okay, so I'm not going to use that corner of sandpaper. I'll use a nice fresh surface in here. Let's test these two. So it's very hard to talk about natural stones in comparison to an artificial grit, because the shape of the grits is so much different than the extremely pointy grit of sandpaper or an artificial stone. Okay? So you have to describe them in terms of what they do. Now both of these are on the edge, on the kind of the margin of being sandstone versus siltstone. It's a relatively fine grit by geology standards, but it's still relatively coarse in terms of sharpening. It's kind of at the margin of sharpening versus grinding. Okay. So I just put a 220 grit scratch pattern on this part of this blade, going lengthwise. And now I'm going to take this stone, I'm going to sharpen perpendicular to where I did that at one location, and then I'll describe to you what I see on the metal with that 220 sandpaper as sort of a reference. The camera won't pick this up. This is fairly hard still. I said these are both indurated sandstone. I can feel a scratch. There's definitely that feedback. Okay. Now, oh man, that's a lot finer than I expected it to be. And just that little bit that I did on here, there's a few residual file scratches. Right where I was working, this was sharp enough and aggressive enough to cut all the way down through those file scratches. But it left a very reflective surface. There aren't a lot of obvious scratches. So I misjudged this. This is a lot finer in its action than I thought it was going to be. I thought this was going to be at the end of coarse going toward, the end of medium, like going toward fine, but this is well into the fine range. That's a beautiful start to a polish right there.
Cool.
I'm happy with this. Okay. Let's do the same. And this will be, it's a medium hardness stone, right? It's not as hard as this other one or as an Arkansas stone. Okay, let's look at, where's the good spot? There's the good spot. Where's my sandpaper? I'm going to go scratch over that surface again. And yes, I'm using a blade for this that has been hardened and tempered, but has not been finished. I don't like to test new stones on finished projects. Okay, I can see my 220 grit scratch pattern across that whole area. So yeah, that one went all the way to a polish. There's not even really a comparison with 220. Let's see what this one does. Okay, I don't see any slurry forming just from the action of the knife, which I didn't expect. I'm trying to dig in. Again, this is not a finished sharpened blade, so I don't mind doing this. I can't dig in. I can't cut a groove in it, which is good, being it's a stone I want to use for graving chisels. Okay, let's see what it did. That also produced a very nice polish, but I can just barely see some of the 220 grit scratches underneath it. Okay, whereas this one cut all the way through some file scratches. This just barely cut through the 220 grit scratches. Okay, that is a big difference between hard and soft stones. As you go toward a harder stone, remember, like I was trying to dig in and couldn't dig in. Okay, that's an advantage to a really hard stone when you're sharpening on a really fine edge. But it is going to be, even if these are the same coarseness, and I don't know what the micron diameter of the grits in them is. I also don't care. But even if these are the same coarseness, just this being softer will make it faster cutting. So when you're doing a wide area of a softer steel, you want a softer stone. And then as you're doing narrower areas and harder steel, you want harder stones. Okay, because they cooperate better. And you really do need to match the stone to the project, which is why there's such an advantage to having a large collection. So I am going to buy a diamond file and finish this with a diamond file. I don't want to go through 18 pieces of sandpaper. Sandpaper would work. Sandpaper would absolutely work and would finish the job. It started the job, it will finish the job. I'm lazy and cheap, and it will be cheaper for me to buy a large diamond file on the cheap end of the spectrum than to buy enough sandpaper on the good end of the spectrum, right? So I'm going to get the right tool and finish that with the right tool. We still got enough done on it to evaluate its usefulness, and I'm happy with it. So again, if you want to see the earlier videos, you can go back. If you want to see me make this, I'll make sure that the video, the Forging Without a Forge video, where I made this in a campfire, shows up in the end screen. And if you would like to support the channel and help us do more things, go look for whetstones, go find geolocations, look for whetstones, do more projects, show you more how to do this stuff. It does take resources. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page. There's lots of great resources and information there for you. So, either way, I hope that you will go find some of your own whetstones, do great projects, and join us here next time at Old Ways Rising.